Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. This is a perfect panel with an important topic, so we warmly welcome here. The title that we've stated is Super Tuesday, What Just Happened? I might have rephrased it to name this distinguished panel about Super Tuesday, wait, what? Right, it's like, so they will answer the question, wait, what, as we proceed. So we have an extraordinary group. First, and we're grateful to them for coming, in some cases, back to the Institute of Politics and remaining here. So first, Mike Allen joins us on the panel. He is, of course, a veteran Washington journalist. He is co-founded 3 years ago now and is the executive editor of Axios. He was important in the founding of Politico as well, and Playbook, which was our must-read. So we
now Axios AM.
Axios, right? Recreated under his great brand. Tiffany Cross is, of course, our IOP resident fellow this semester, where she's leading a study group on representation in the media, and she is also the co-founder and of the Beat DC. And so we're delighted to have Tiffany here. And of course, Galen Druke, who's the host and producer of the podcast FiveThirtyEight Politics podcast. His voice is well known to all of us, and certainly from a lot of his work on NPR and others. And of course, we're thrilled to have Margaret Talev back, an IOP fan favorite, who is a resident fellow. She is returning. She is the White House and Politics editor at Axios, having served as the White House editor for Bloomberg and past president of the White House Correspondents Association. So thank you, Margaret, for moderating. Thank you all for joining us. They will answer the question for Super Tuesday, what just happened? Welcome.
Thanks, guys. So we have hardcore political junkies in the audience tonight, and so my game plan is we're going to talk for a few minutes, and then the second half of the program will be all of your questions. So think of really good zingers or difficult, tough questions to ask these guys, and then we'll make it happen in the second half. But I think I want to start where Mark left off, Mike, which is what did just happen?
So thank you very much for teeing me up with spoiler. We'll have the answer to that, the definitive answer to that. But first, I want to thank all of you for coming out. It's such an honor to be in this amazing place where so many fascinating life stories have played out, and where so many people who care about public service, who recognize the value of public service, have come and gone on to serve our country and our world. So it's a treat to be here, and always fascinating conversations. Mark, thank you for your hospitality. He's been a friend for a long time. And just pause to respect must be paid, kiss the ring. It's our great honor that the founding dean, the great Graham Allison, is here. So we're honored that you're here. So Margaret Talev, we're so fortunate, is now the White House and Politics editor of Axios. As Mark mentioned, we're in year 4, just finished our 3rd year. We started, Axios launched 2 days before President Trump was inaugurated. So I always tell people, I'll let you decide who's had a better 3 years. But we're very fortunate to have Margaret, who has done such a great job leading our coverage. And what happened Tuesday night is inspiring, exciting, energizing, and that is voters reminded us that they're in charge. And it's very easy for us to forget that. And especially in this cycle. I know this is a hard time. I've been visiting with a lot of your colleagues who talk about what a difficult time this is to look around at what's happening in the world. And I found Tuesday night very inspiring because we so often think we know what voters are thinking, think we know what voters are doing, and we were reminded then that we don't. A quick story about this cycle, and one of the great things about these times is that people know that their voices matter. People know that what they do counts. And one thing I've always said over the years is voters don't vote like political scientists or pundits. No offense. They vote like people, right? What's funny is this year Democratic voters are so concerned about getting it right that that's not as true anymore. You'll hear voters saying, well, if I were a guy in a diner in Pennsylvania, I would be thinking, like, voters have never talked like that before. And something that one of the campaigns told me, they were in a focus group in Iowa, and they were talking about how you beat Trump. And a 34-year-old male in this focus group said, well, if I were an average voter, I would. And the guy's like, dude, you are a 34-year-old male in a focus group in Iowa. You are an average voter.
Right. So Mike's like the eternal optimist, and I'm pretty optimistic. Like, I run happy more than I run sad. But that is like a very positive spin on what just happened. The other thing that just happened is that it shows that, like, we don't know. Like, you're watching the news or you're reading.
Don't listen to us.
It's like journalists are looking at data points. They're looking at polling that may have been very accurate in the moment. They're looking at the way history has worked in the past. They're looking at things that people are supposed to they're supposed to be decent predictors of behavior, like how much money is left in the bank, what kind of ads do they have on TV, what's their digital presence, is the staffing well organized, are they on the rise or are they falling according to polls, what do the favorability numbers look like, and none of that, well, you tell me, I don't think any of it actually predicted what happened, but maybe I'm completely wrong.
Probably the main thing that predicted what happened on Tuesday was, well, actually the decades of theory known as the party decides, right? For a long time, political scientists have suggested that the party has a lot more control over the primary process than it would appear based on how voters vote in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, etc. In fact, the party is marshaling resources, vetting candidates behind the scenes, and trying to figure out who they think is the best standard bearer, the most likely to win. And that theory fell completely apart on the Republican side in 2016. It held up on the Democratic side in 2016 for the most part. Sanders probably did better than you would have imagined given the party decides theory. And that's probably in large part due to the power that grassroots fundraising has taken away from party elites. But really, we saw from basically Wednesday, Representative James Clyburn's endorsement of Joe Biden in South Carolina to a blowout by Joe Biden in South Carolina, then a waterfall of endorsements on that Monday, and I think voters got the sense that if I'm a capital D Democrat and I want this party to succeed in the fall, I know who to vote for. And they turned out and voted. And you saw particularly late deciders, people who hadn't made up their mind for one candidate or another before Tuesday, going for Joe Biden. They got the signal and they cast their vote accordingly.
I want to get back to the late deciders in a minute, but Tiffany, I want to ask you, like, because we would all like for the role of the press to just be like not really like a filter that puts its thumb on the scale, but just honest brokers who tell you what's going on, what's actually going on. How do you read the press coverage of this Democratic primary so far, and how do you think it's impacted what has happened in these various contests and the trajectory things are taking now?
Yeah, so I think what happened on Super Tuesday is we noted the chasm between voters and the media. I was not as surprised. I think, the people who cover these campaigns in newsrooms are still overwhelmingly white and male. 2/3 of newsroom staff are white males. And I think you saw when you said voters decide, I would pin down on that and say voters of color decide Democratic primaries. You talked about people going to diners and talking to voters. voters. And I've used this example a few times that when they go to these diners where no black or brown people ever eat, and they talk to these voters from the heartland, and I just think, man, if they went to a Golden Corral in Birmingham, Alabama after church let out, aren't those voters from the heartland? Or if they went to a Wingstop in East Cleveland or Detroit, aren't those voters from the heartland, a swing state I might add? So I think when you have this huge gap between who's on the campaign trail, who's filling up newsrooms, it shows what a missed opportunity this is, because while there were some in the field who were clutching their pearls and super surprised, I think there were huge blocks of voters who were like, y'all are surprised, really? Because we aren't. I think that's something that has to be better. Then when you revisit the debate coverage, what happened during the debates, it's like every political conversation on political panels, at the debates that happened across the country, they centered white people at every turn. And not only white people, but conservative white people. And that is not the base. The Democratic Party lost that base a long time ago, in the 60s to be exact, when the voting electorate was 89% white. And it sometimes feels the media has not yet caught up with that. And so when you ask these voters, well, how are you going to appeal to swing states? How are you going to get some of these swing voters? Well, the better question is, how are you going to energize the base? How are you going to get people out there who have been longtime Democratic voters to vote for you? Because the swing voter that either will stay home or is a MAGA voter, that ain't the person who's getting you elected. And so I think there are a lot of people who are more pragmatic voters who have to leapfrog over the media elites to get their interest and their voices heard, and we saw that happen. And so I'm curious to see how the rest of the media coverage will go from now till Election Day to center the Democratic base as a part of this conversation, because we quite frankly haven't seen that happen. There were very few questions, and I think we tend to look at diversity through the lens of black and white, literally and figuratively. This year, 2020, will be the first time that voters from the Latinx community will eclipse black voters in terms of eligible voters. How many questions did we hear during the Democratic debates that focused on Latinx voters? The Asian American community is the fastest growing demographic in the country. How many questions did we hear that centered Asian American voters? It really didn't. And these issues, black voters care about things beyond criminal justice reform. Latinx voters care about issues beyond immigration reform. And yet again, you saw this huge chasm where it seems like those on the campaign trail and those occupying newsrooms were left scratching their heads after Super Tuesday, when the majority of the Democratic voting base was saying, we tried to tell you, and now here we are.
Some of the numbers, some of the polling numbers that looked at the African American vote really did show this bifurcation between who younger black voters would support and who older African American voters said they were going to support. And I think in South Carolina, although these are all like you're saying, the red arrow is not where you're going to find America's diversity basket, right? But it was the data didn't track with what actually happened. And I'm wondering, do you think that Jim Clyburn was as important as people attribute this to? Do you see, do you think that do you think that there were younger African American voters who were going to go with Bernie Sanders who gravitated to Biden in the end?
Right.
And why do you think that happened?
So in South Carolina, Biden actually took 40% of young black voters. And then when you got to those older voters, the numbers increased. I think it would be a mistake for us to think that South Carolina represents all black voters. So what black voters value in South Carolina might be very different from what young black voters value in California. I also think when it comes to data, look, polling minority communities sometimes is its own science, right? And so I've been, in media for over 20 years, but I've also taken a break and worked on a campaign or two. And when you have these polling groups, these focus groups, like I've been a part of focus groups where you might have, we've had like a black man poll a group of all white women, and the answers are always different. It's like, take that black man out of there and put another white woman in there and ask those same questions and see the answers that you get, and they change. The same is true for communities of color when it comes to these focus groups. And so I don't always follow the data on that, with all due respect to the data people and like Steve Kornackis of the world. I think if he's asking a question from voters of color, you might get a different answer when you have like a Cornell Belcher posing those questions or a Fernand Amandi posing those questions. So I am not necessarily believing the polls.
The data itself may not reflect the true sentiment on the ground because of biases in
Yes.
in the people who are asking.
And people lie. Like now, I think there is, shame among some people to say they're voting for Trump, perhaps. And so they're not necessarily honest about their votes. Well, the same can happen in all other communities. And I think, when you get to like Jim Clyburn's endorsement, for example, yes, in South Carolina, that was hugely important. I mean, he is a kingmaker. Biden has never had to carry a national ticket on his own. So both times in the space where he needed to ascend to this national level, he needed someone from the community to, kind of don him this kingmaker. And I think when you start to look at the voters who voted for him and who, why that mattered, well, in the media landscape, like, for example, with Warren, we were talking a bit backstage. Well, there were some people who really liked Warren. Particularly, there's this narrative that like black voters never connected with Warren. Well, that's not necessarily true, but in the media, the only voters who have the benefit of being disaggregated are white voters. You always hear the soccer moms or college-educated white men.
NASCAR
you don't
dads.
get that. Right, exactly. But what about black voters?
Right.
College-educated black women, a lot liked Warren. Uncollege-educated black men, some of those folks went for Biden because they didn't trust the rest of the electorate to vote in their interest. So
Is this sample sizes or just a lack of curiosity on the part of pollsters?
I think it is ignorance, and when I say that, I mean a true lack of knowledge. And it's part ignorance, and it's also part arrogance. That my perspective is the one that matters most. It's arrogance that the world, particularly in America, has always centered white people. So why should that change now? It's not intentional, but I think it's troublesome for people to catch up with an ever-changing demographic and not having the humility to say, you know what, guys, we might have this wrong. Let's make this newsroom, let's be intentional about making our newsroom more diverse so we can make our coverage more inclusive. Cable news is probably like the worst offender of this. The average viewer is like 62, 63-year-old white men across all the cable channels. Well, gosh, cable news executives have to know these folks aren't immortal. And so as this dynamic changes, how are you going to introduce content to this new audience who's increasingly tuning you out with more content from Netflix to, all kind of streaming services? Everything's begging for their attention. How are you going to make your coverage relevant to folks who look like me and the generation behind me to trust you as a source of information? And we saw what happened in 2016 when voters of color said, you know what, you're not speaking to me, I'm tuning you out. And what happened? They started listening to voices who acknowledged theirs, and we come to find out those were nefarious voices. It was the Internet Russia Agency. There were foreign actors. So this go round, Russia has some company. You have Iran already infiltrating our election system, and I don't imagine China will sit this one out. And so if the only time you saw outrage about what was happening in your community came from a nefarious voice, that was the voice you're going to listen to. So I think it's extra responsibility on all news outlets to make sure that we are representing what the American people look like and not what media elites and people in green rooms are talking about, but not talking about voters of color, but talking to voters of color to make sure that your coverage is accurate.
And if I may make a related point, and it's a fascinating window, and I agree with everything you said. Something to add to that, one of the most prescient stories about this cycle, and this is something we've talked about for a long time, but that was documented last spring, I believe, the New York Times front page story. Blue Twitter is not the Democratic Party.
Yep.
And Twitter is not America, but it is in newsrooms. And that's part of the input that left us surprised, baffled, and saying, wait, what?
Yeah.
Wait, what? I saw you raise your eyebrows at a data point and then we lost the thread like 5 minutes ago, but what were you thinking?
I mean, Twitter is not the Democratic Party or America, and that's exactly why we look to polls in order to better understand America. Because what are polls? They're interviews with people, right? Traditional reporting, you can go out and you get an unrepresentative sample and you talk to somebody here and you talk to somebody there, but the scientific method is built in order to get a representative sample. And I don't think I would agree that the polls got it wrong or that we were totally blindsided by an undercurrent that existed in the electorate that kind of turned out on Tuesday that surprised us all. This is a Democratic primary. That means it is extremely easy to switch from one candidate to the next. They're all Democrats. Yeah. And because of ideological sorting, they aren't all that different. Maybe you can make the argument that Bernie Sanders is quite different, but still on pretty much all of the social and economic issues, they're there. And so what we saw was really swift movement in favor of Joe Biden. You could see that starting heading into South Carolina, right? Like 2 weeks before South Carolina, Biden and Sanders were neck and neck in South Carolina. I believe that. Like, I think it's fair to look at the polling and say, yeah, there were some black voters who were attracted to Bloomberg, there were some black voters who were attracted to Sanders, and there were black voters who were attracted to Biden. But as soon as the party establishment, the most senior African-American congressman in the Democratic Party, said, you know what, I trust Biden, and very aggressively, I don't trust Sanders, you saw those people move. And before Super Tuesday, we got, the morning of Super Tuesday, we got polling out of Virginia showing Biden up 20 points there. And so things changed so quickly because this is the Democratic Party and they're all voting for Democrats that you couldn't see the tsunami coming in a way if you just looked at the
wasn't
data.
Gonna tell you anything.
We didn't have recent enough data, and the data that was recent was showing what was about to happen.
This is a really interesting point because I think anyone could be looking at those numbers when you went from Iowa to New Hampshire into Nevada and say, if you just added up like Buttigieg and Klobuchar and Biden, you'd have a bigger number than Sanders. And then everyone's like, yeah, but you can't add up those numbers. It doesn't work that way. Like, turned out actually that you could add up those numbers and pretty much work that way. You're better at math than I am, but that's close enough, right?
And another thing to note here, the place where Sanders did overwhelmingly well, Nevada, is a caucus state, and turnout is so low that you can't rely on those results for any kind of representative sample of the Democratic electorate, right? It's super enthusiastic people. It's a state of 3 million people. Like 100,000 people voted in those primaries or caucuses. And so, I think rely more on primaries. The data is not perfect, but it's the best representative sample that we have of what voters think.
There's two people we haven't talked about yet, and we need to talk about both of them. One's Michael Bloomberg, but the other who I'd like to start with is Elizabeth Warren. She's out. Mike, what does it mean? Who does it help? How will it play out?
So just to set a baseline, I'd love to hear my colleagues on this, but Elizabeth Warren has vastly exceeded expectations. So there was a tweet today, some of you will remember whose tweet it was, that said, Elizabeth Warren is the best political athlete in the field. And what did they mean by that? So one of the ways that she surprised was she embraced the idea about talking about serious topics in a serious way and made her, I've got a plan for that, something that worked for her. And through the year-ish in the lead up to the actual voting, she really excited crowds. And the whole selfie line thing, and they weren't selfies, it was a campaign photographer, but she worked the crowd in a way that you could not have forecast if you'd watched her as an Obama administration official or as a senator. And we were talking backstage, exactly why she fell off a cliff has not been fully explained. It is not completely because of attention to Medicare for All. That is part of it. Something that polling about Medicare for All, going back years, shows you, and this is Kaiser Family Foundation polling, which has been quite consistent and quite accurate. People are generally for Medicare for All until you tell them a single thing about it. And it doesn't matter what it is, what it costs, what you give up, it goes down. That hit her a little bit, but that's not all, right?
Well, I think with Warren, there were a lot of people who liked her. But again, I think the Democratic primary, particularly voters of color, which makes up the base, tends to vote more pragmatic. And I don't think they trusted the rest of the electorate to get behind Warren. There were so many people who said, I like her, but I'm afraid of how the rest of America will vote.
Do you think that voters of color in the Democratic primary took a more strategic approach just en masse? Why do you think that?
100%. Well, I think all voters of color, I think, have to be pragmatic, but I think black voters in particular, and I hope this changes soon, so I'm not saying this is the right approach, but I think nobody values freedom and liberty more than the descendants of those who once did not have it. And so I think black voters don't always recognize the full power that they have to shape representative government, and they think, Elizabeth Warren maybe has plans. I like what she's saying. She's speaking to me. She's, actually centering people who look like me around these plans. But am I going to trust white women to vote for her? Am I going to trust white men to vote for her? I think there is a sentiment of this country really dislikes women, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. It is, just a fact that we have seen. And so I think there is fear. And so people don't, particularly voters of color, don't have the privilege of voting for their ideals. They have to vote for the least problematic person who will cause the least harm to the community, and who they think the rest of America will get behind. And I thought Elizabeth Warren ran a great campaign. She was erased by a lot of the media even before Super Tuesday happened. The media decided this is now a two-person race. And I know the data, likely supported that, but I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. The more
that balance between coverage and
the more
outcome.
someone is talked about, the donor class pays attention, voters pay attention. I don't know why voters and viewers need to hear about polls every week, because the only people who really need to know about that are campaigns. And so when you keep hearing, Elizabeth Warren fell. I can't remember who did the poll, but it was maybe 2 months ago, and it was like Elizabeth Warren, dropped significantly in the polls. Well, when you look at some of these polls, this one in particular, and I can't remember who it was, the margin of error was quite considerable. And then when you look at the time period where this poll was done, and you rarely have the benefit of doing that in cable news, which is unfortunately the arbiter of so much information, and it's like, this poll was done during the impeachment process where you kept hearing over and over and over Joe Biden's name, or somebody tweeted something and it became a big deal between Sanders and Biden. And so voters who are not paying attention to the minutia, like all of us on this stage are, might hear that, and that informs their choice when they're called by a pollster to weigh in on something. But unfortunately, in the echo chamber of sound bites and quick clips and
things become
opinion
simplistic
fighting,
and then they get
right.
Yeah. Galen, what does the data tell us about Elizabeth Warren? Does her block of support matter numerically? Does it matter more in terms of policy and shaping where Sanders and Biden go now, discussion-wise?
So what we know about Elizabeth Warren is that Democrats really like her. And that when you look at her favorability ratings, when you ask people kind of these roundabout polling questions, like if you could wave a magic wand and make somebody president, regardless of whether or not you think they're electable, who would you pick? And Elizabeth Warren wins some of those kinds of polls. And in fact, she was, a co-front runner during the fall, right? I think you're absolutely right, was subjected to Democratic voters who in many ways did want to act like pundits and try to figure out who the rest of the population would see as electable. There was a lot of that strategic voting going on and a lot of paying attention to the polls as a result. And I think we can definitely dissect that and talk about whether or not that's a good thing, right? I think horse race coverage is an important piece of political coverage, but I don't think that it should be the majority of it or anywhere close. And I think voters should focus on what they need in their communities more than they focus on what somebody in another part of the country with a different background thinks about, right? So we focus on it at 538, but that doesn't mean you need to focus on it, right? We're one small little newsroom. We're 35 people. And so I would say the same to cable news. In terms of her coalition, it's generally white and college educated. And there was some overlap with Pete Buttigieg for sure. And I think it's complicated. On one hand, they're clearly pretty liberal. They like liberal policy positions that you might think would align better with Bernie Sanders. On the other hand, she's more of an establishment figure. She's a capital D Democrat. And you could see those priorities aligning with Joe Biden. One thing we did see on Super Tuesday is that Biden beat Sanders by about 11 points among women. Right? And, part of the coverage of Bernie Sanders' campaign for now, 4 years is that it's sexist. And I wouldn't say that, Bernie Sanders is, but there's definitely a strain within his campaign that we can see it in the polling data, women feel is hostile to them.
You're talking about the Bernie bros.
Yeah. And so, given that also Warren performed better amongst women, I think that there are tensions pulling people in different ways. There's the liberal policy, there's the establishment, and there's the, sexism. And so I think probably a lot of Elizabeth Warren voters are going to have to take some time to figure out what they want to do, because clearly they looked at both Biden and Sanders on Super Tuesday, even though they were the leaders in the race and it seemed like strategically you had to vote for one of them. They still voted for Warren. Yeah. So that means they don't like him.
Well, also she was persisting. I mean, that was such a core part of her brand, right? Which is like, I decide what I'm doing, and I decide how long I stay, and no one's going to tell me what to do, and Mitch McConnell's not going to tell me what to do, and Bernie and Joe aren't going to tell me what to do. So I do think if you were a core Elizabeth Sanders supporter, it completely makes sense that you would say, as long as she's here, I'm with her,
But I think the Sanders people did not treat her as well either. And I mean his supporters. His supporters are... every time I say this publicly, I just wait, like RIP to my mentions, because they just attack. And it's not necessarily against Bernie, but when the hashtag like Elizabeth Warren dropout started trending, some of that rhetoric is pretty ugly, and it just reminds me of like the guy who keeps asking you out and you're like, no, not interested, not interested, not interested, and it's like, well, forget you, because you ugly anyway, like that's kind of how it felt their treatment was with Elizabeth Warren. So now here she is with this power. Who do I endorse? And it's like, ideologically, I don't see how she endorses Biden, but then Sanders treated her so crappy. So I really don't know where she goes, and I don't know where her voters go. But I do think that another chasm that we noted in the media is that words like socialism and moderates, these are words that are generated by a very, elite class of, the chatter class of punditry. Because when you get out there,
make different things to different
people.
Totally.
When you ask people, like, hey, well, how do you feel about socialism? And they're like, no, I don't want that. And it's like, well, how do you feel about free college and a $15 minimum wage?
I'm all for that. Right.
Yeah. Now that sign me up for.
That's something I can get behind.
Exactly.
All right, I want to do one more question before we begin handing the microphone over to you guys, and I want to ask each of you this question: is there going to be a brokered convention? Put a percentage on it. Put your bet on it, or what will be the thing that decides whether there will be a brokered convention?
So we're supposed to call it a contested convention now. Yeah. The party will tell you that there aren't brokers, but this is such a fascinating possibility, and we all always talk about it, and Mark and I have fantasized about brokered conventions at different times. But you look at the math, and if Senator Sanders at all gets back on the bike next week, there was a poll today showing Biden up in Michigan, and so that makes you a little skeptical about whether that's going to happen. But if there's very clear ways that the math could work for Senator Sanders for a while. Margaret Talev wrote in our analysis the other day, like this could last a while. And that's where you get into the territory of someone who goes into the convention without it clinched. They have a clear lead, they probably have momentum, but they don't have a mathematical clinch. And the speculation had been Mike Bloomberg would be well positioned at a time like that. He'd spent a lot of money with mayors and governors over the years. Joe Biden has the social and professional relationships with them over the time. Could he do well? It's hard to imagine, knowing where the Democratic Party is now, that someone would go in with a plurality and not be the nominee. Do you buy that?
I guess it depends on what the plurality is, but my instinct is this is not going to go down to the wire like that. But who knows? I've been wrong on a lot of things.
A reporter can dream.
What do you think? Yes, no?
I think to your point, the media is salivating at the idea of a contested convention, but I think it's going to be, I hope anyway, it's going to be anticlimactic and it's not going to be contested.
What do the numbers tell you?
At this point, it doesn't look like there will be a contested convention, in particular because Bloomberg and Warren have now dropped out of the race. They didn't get a lot of delegates anyway, and so you would have to have it come down to the difference between Biden and Sanders would have to be smaller than the number of delegates that have already been awarded to Buttigieg, Klobuchar, etc. And, Bloomberg's 6 in American Samoa. Laugh line. But
sad.
If what we're seeing in the very early polls post Super Tuesday holds up, I mean, we saw a poll in Florida this morning that showed Biden leading Sanders by 40 points, and even still including Bloomberg in the poll. if that's any indication of where this race is headed, and of course something could happen, right? We've never seen a head-to-head debate between Biden and Sanders before, and your guess is as good as mine.
Literally
in
anything
terms
could
of
happen.
what
Right.
will happen. But if that's any indication of where we're headed, it doesn't look like there will be a contested convention, and Biden seems to be front runner at this point.
Although people drop out, when they drop out, they suspend.
Yeah.
That's where the dream lives, is that someone is going to rise from the ashes of suspension and freak everybody out. So, all right, there's a microphone somewhere in this room, and I would like to start passing it around. There's one, and there's another. So when I call on you, if you would be so kind, tell us your name, tell us who you are. Are you a student? Are you in the community? And if your question is for one person, then tell that person that your question is for them. Start with you, sir.
We can hear you.
We'll,
Yes.
we'll repeat it.
Okay, so 2 questions, if you don't mind, and pick one. Bart Lloyd, a member of the community, walked over to see the show. So 2 questions. Hunter Biden, is that fatal? And then secondarily, and this is for Galen, with polls, for 42 states, what does it matter, right? For the 8 states that matter, so how should we adapt our, weight our polls so that they're really meaningful? So either question.
Great, thanks. Could everyone hear the questions? Okay.
I'll
Hunter.
take Hunter. So Axios has reporting from our colleague Elena Treen, one of Margaret's part of Margaret's team, that the Trump team we were talking salivated earlier. The Trump team is very excited to bring this issue back. We can expect to hear them talk about it a lot. The president, if you look back over his campaigns, what is the president good at? One of his strengths is branding, demeaning an opponent. And ask President Cruz, ask President Rubio what it's like to be in the sights of Donald Trump. And so he early on, with Vice President Biden, picked up on this issue and has been pretty relentless, pretty fearless about bringing it up. And with the megaphone that he has, for us, people see the clip, and then FiveThirtyEight and Axios and others come on and say, well, does that improve it? It makes it very difficult. So the Trump campaign wants to just throw it out there, and you're going to see a lot of that, which is a real challenge for how to cover it.
So I'll say about Hunter, I don't think he's fatal, and I take your point that Trump is very good at, the juvenile antics, but I think that works for his base, not necessarily Democratic voters. And I also think that, if the Biden campaign were smart, they would put it out there themselves. We saw some of this stuff in 2016, and a lot of this stuff is out there. It just shows maybe how bad the GOP Oppo research is. The Atlantic did a huge profile on Hunter Biden, and they talk about he met this homeless black woman and invited her to live with him for a while. Her name was Bicycles. And I think reading that, I was I grew up in the city. I know what that was. You guys were not just hanging out. He wasn't helping a homeless woman. They were in there doing what they whatever drug of choice. And I think if the GOP outreach or Oppo research were on it, we might see Bicycles get paraded out at one of these debates, which is going to be challenging for him. But I think the Biden campaign can certainly appeal to parents all across this country who are dealing with children who are addicts and put it out there themselves. My colleague Tara, who's here, who's a Republican, but she said they should do it like Eminem and 8 Mile. When you come back with that, verse, put it all out there themselves so nobody can put it out there for you. If they don't do that and people are hearing it for the first time from Trump, then Trump gets to frame the narrative.
There's also the one question that we hear is, well, if President Trump's campaign or affiliate organizations try to bring back up Hunter issues, can't Democrats go after President Trump's children for conflicts of interest and that sort of stuff? That's maybe another question for here. Galen, you had.
The other thing that's important to know is that the American public knows Joe Biden really well. There's almost nobody in America who doesn't already know him. And so opinions of him are more solidified than they would be with somebody like a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar, where you put out a bunch of oppo and all of a sudden this person is branded by that one particular incident. People already have a pretty good idea of how they feel about Joe Biden, whether it's good or bad. When it comes to polling swing states, sure, of course, we live in a country that is governed by the winner of the Electoral College. And so, yeah, the swing states matter, but which swing states matter, right? So, maybe Arizona is a more important state than Wisconsin this year. Maybe Texas is in play. Maybe Georgia's in play. Maybe Florida isn't in play.
Right.
So I think,
Wait, do you think any of that's true? Do you actually think Texas is in play?
Yeah, it's possible, for sure. I mean, this is an anecdotal story that, I wouldn't put too much weight on because, we like to look at the data, but I spoke to, a contact in Texas who does data work for the GOP, and he said, looking at the lines because Republicans and Democrats wait in different lines to use different machines in Harris County, looking at the lines, for the Democratic machines, those look like our voters, right? Like, he's like, I feel queasy about this, right? And it's because of a lot of things. It's because more Hispanics in Texas are aging into being able to vote. It's a young part of the electorate. It's in large part because white suburban voters have voted Republican for a lot longer in the South than they have in the Northeast. And so you have people who would be your stereotypical country club Republicans being like, if it's Trump or Biden, I might vote for Biden. And you already saw in 2016 that they voted for Gary Johnson, or they wrote in, somebody else, Mitt Romney, or in some cases they even voted for Hillary Clinton.
Didn't you tell me that there were a couple? This is not a poll question, but there were a couple of swing-ish or purplish, whatever states in the last wave of contests. Like, some of those Biden voters were not longtime Democrats, were they?
Yeah, so in some polls, not a lot, you can ask, what's the last primary you voted in? And if the last primary they voted in is a Republican primary, then you can assume that at least they're open to voting for Republicans or have gone back and forth in the past. And it looked like some of those people heading into South Carolina were leaning towards Bloomberg, but it looks like in South Carolina, they actually went for Biden. And on Super Tuesday, we had a lot of those parts of the country with the well-to-do suburban voters vote, right? Northern Virginia, suburbs of DC, suburbs of Dallas and Houston, suburbs of LA, Orange County, right? Like Reagan's, where kind of
Formerly known as
Reagan
Orange
formed
County,
his coalition. Turnout was really up there, and Biden did really well in those places. And so, you
and that
have to
suggests
kind
to
of
you
wonder.
those are Republican crossovers.
I mean, a lot of them are people who would have liked Hillary Clinton and are Democrats and so on, right? It's not like a ton of Republicans are now voting in a Democratic primary, but I'm pretty sure, and you'll be able to dig into the voter file and figure out who actually voted in these precincts and see if they last voted in the Republican primary, and then you'll get a better sense. But I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Can I just say, Margaret, for Georgia and Texas being in play, we really have to talk more about the voter suppression efforts that take place in Texas and Georgia, because if it weren't such rampant voter suppression, those would both be purple states. We also don't know who the VP pick will be. Mm-hmm. And if by some chance it's Stacey Abrams, then Georgia is absolutely in play. She is a national figure who had better name recognition than Kamala Harris at a certain point. And Brian Kemp who's the governor of Georgia, has definitely made the pipeline to the ballot box very narrow for white Republican voters. So there's a lot of organizations like hers, Fair Fight, election organizations that are fighting some of the voter suppression that's happening, and they're winning battles, court battles. So if that happens, then certainly these could potentially be purple states at play.
I want to go to you, sir.
One of the great mantras of Elizabeth Warren was, quote, "I have a plan for that," end of quote. Now, in the scenario, if neither of the two Bs, Bernie or Biden, get the magical 1991 delegates, and it's let's call it a broker convention. I noticed with George Orwell, when you immediately change the language, you get control. If there is a convention in which nobody gets it on the first ballot, could you imagine Elizabeth Warren being something of a power broker in which she says, I will give you my delegates if you adopt Plan A, B, C, D, or E?
Wait, which delegates?
Warren.
Well, Warren doesn't have a lot of delegates.
Right. That was my point.
So it's not likely to happen.
You got to have the delegates to give the delegates, right?
And she dropped out, so she's not getting any more. Presumably, unless a lot, Warren stands might just keep voting for her anyway. But you have to get 15% or more in order to get delegates, and that's not likely to happen.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Meena Venkataraman, and I'm a junior at the college. My question actually, Tiffany, you just alluded to this, but I wanted to dig a little deeper about the prospective vice presidential running mate. What are your thoughts specifically as it applies to people of color and women? Do you think that the vice presidential running mate will definitely be a woman or a person of color? Do you think that whether it's Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, who come from, East Coast, predominantly white states, do you think that it's imperative they choose someone who will complement them in terms of both their ethnicity, their background, as well as the kind of electorates they cater to? So what are your thoughts on this, and how could that prospectively affect who they get as voters?
So I would say for Biden, there is a debt owed, and I think he knows that. Despite the chasm we saw in the media and voters, it was Black voters overwhelmingly who helped deliver a 9-state victory to him on Super Tuesday. If he values that vote, then he would pick a woman of color as his running mate. Bernie, I'm less certain about. He tends to prioritize economic inequality over racial inequality, so I'm not sure who he would pick should he, somehow ascend to be the front runner. But I think something that people have to realize is, what is your VP pick giving you? So we saw, in 2016, Clinton picked Tim Kaine, not necessarily because she thought he was so awesome, but she knew he could deliver Virginia, a swing state. He spoke Spanish, so he could speak to some of those Latinx voters. So in this space, the names who have floated, obviously Kamala Harris is at the top of that list. Biden's going to have to contend with. Both of them have kind of sketchy criminal justice backgrounds. He voted for the crime bill. Kamala Harris has this Kamala's a cop meme, which was obviously propelled by Russian interference in the election, but it's still penetrated with the party base. And so
when
some
you
people
say sketchy criminal justice, you don't mean that they have sketchy criminal justice
No.
backgrounds. You mean
No.
that they come from these sort of law and order backgrounds
yes.
that have had
her
racial
background as a
disparities.
prosecutor is there's this weird hierarchy of blame, I think, among Black voters. That's like, you were locking up Black men, and this almost statistically impossible in San Francisco, but that still became the narrative attached to her by a lot of Black voters, unfortunately. So that's something for him to think about. Like I said, Stacey Abrams is a hugely popular figure in the Democratic politics. She's made no secret about the fact that she wants it. A name that hasn't been talked about as much in the media, yes, but not as much in Democratic circles, I think, is Val Demings, who's a congresswoman from Orlando, one of the House impeachment managers, first Black police chief in Orlando. But again, I just don't know how that plays with Black voters who, there's a very thin line on, you were a part of a system that imprisoned me or imprisoned someone who looks like me, and can we forgive that when you're coupled with a Joe Biden who voted for a crime bill that emphasized mandatory minimums that devastated generations of the Black community? So, it's anyone's guess, but I would be shocked and appalled that they did not have a woman of color on the ticket with them.
What do you guys think?
For sure. I think, I was down in South Carolina ahead of the primary there, and you heard from voters that you talked to. I'm planning on voting for Biden. And I think I said something like, what could you hear from him today that would make you really happy? And it was, he would announce his VP as Kamala Harris, right? I think there is an understanding almost, because he floated this before he even got in the race, that he would be picking a woman of color as his VP if he were to win the nomination. I tend to think it won't be Stacey Abrams, only because she hasn't won a statewide election, and he's very old. And so in the same way that there was a lot of attention on McCain's VP pick and whether or not she was qualified to take over as president. Now, I am not drawing any comparisons between Sarah Palin and Stacey Abrams, but I think that the Biden camp would be worried about not picking somebody who's more battle-tested in a statewide race. I've been racking my brain, actually, like, who would Biden pick? I keep coming back to Kamala Harris, but there are other options out there. You have some governors, you have some senators, you have Tammy Baldwin, you have, the Tammys, Tammy Duckworth, you have, you have senators in Nevada and New Mexico. And so, there are some other possibilities out there, but
Kamala Harris sounds like the name to beat right now.
And Sanders, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mike, what do you think of?
Let's go. You got a long line.
There. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie. I'm a resident of Watertown, and I guess this is a general question, but kind of directed toward Galen. So everyone thinks that their candidate is getting the media blackout, and part of it was the issue of just having so many, and also just so much in the news cycle happening, especially between the Iowa caucuses and Super Tuesday. So I was wondering if there's any way to sort of be measuring, is someone getting a media blackout? Because I feel like in sort of the Twitter sphere of confirmation bias, that perceptions of the media and sort of antipathy towards the media is going to get really charged, especially as the election progresses.
Is your question, are you asking whether Biden or Sanders could be blacked out, get a media blackout, or are you saying, are some of the people who have since dropped out, were they kind of suppressed and pushed into dropping out by an under coverage? Is that what you're asking?
I'm wondering if you think that this perception of like media blackouts, how that shaped the process, or how we got here and what happened.
I feel like there's been more media coverage than ever and more attention to it, which is something that's encouraging. Like last week, the top two primetime broadcast network shows were both about 2020. The debate from South Carolina and the 60 Minutes interview with Joe Biden. You look at what's available digitally, like any candidate, if you want to see every event, like every one of the major candidates had an embed with them from every network who was posting every day. So the coverage was there, and there were a couple of quirks with the way that polls were presented that had, I thought, the Yang Gang with a very legitimate objection. And so you heard some of that from them. Did you feel like this race is undercovered?
Yes, I think there was definitely a media blackout. There were literally graphics that sometimes didn't include Kamala Harris, who was polling higher than some people, when Julian Castro, who should have been a respected contender when he announced, I think he announced in early December, maybe November, when Elizabeth Warren announced, they were saying, oh, we finally have the first serious person announcing their candidacy. And when I was on air at that time, I would constantly have to say, I'm sorry, Julian Castro actually announced last month. Andrew Yang, again, another person who was constantly left out. They were like boycotting MSNBC because they felt like, he didn't get a lot of talk time and he wasn't as covered. His face would be left off of graphics and promos for the debate.
But now the ultimate payback now is a contributor on cable.
CNN, exactly.
Cover this, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I definitely think, look, every campaign feels like they're not getting covered, but if you just step back and look at it from an unbiased perspective, it's like, I actually see how Castro could feel like, hey guys, I'm here, I exist. I can see how, Kamala Harris felt like, when she announced, it was this huge coverage, this huge ground swelling for her, and it was an impossible standard to maintain, and so then it just became like, we got it already. So for sure, there were people who were embedded in the campaign, And print, I think, drives a lot of the broadcast coverage. But I think you also saw like overinflated coverage. I think no diss to the Pete Buttigieg fans in the audience, but I think, with Pete, you saw like he was kind of this media invention,
Well,
It
Beto
was like,
for a while. Remember, it was like breathless, like Beto's pulling up in his rental car.
Yeah,
Like, great.
yeah. Well, before he even announced, it was like this groundswelling of like Beto's going to save us, and then it was like, it was the B-boys, I remember, between Beto, and Buttigieg. And so when you had this huge, notion, and how many people have heard of Wayne Messam? Right. Not a lot of people. He was also a mayor of a small town in Florida who declared that he was going to run for president, which he happened to be an African American, which, I heard that and I thought this is ridiculous. No more ridiculous than Pete Buttigieg thinking I'm mayor of South Bend and I can be president. No diss, because I know he went to Harvard and there might be some Pete people here. But I think when you saw that and you saw like this kind of Morning Joe crowd, offering him this groundswell where there were other candidates who were not getting the benefit of that coverage, they gifted him with all this coverage before he earned it from the people. And when you looked at the Democratic voting base, looking at this, they just sat back and said, okay, we'll see when it's time to cast a vote. And we did see. So I completely understand a lot of the campaigns who felt like they were undercovered and not treated fairly, particularly with a lot of the hit pieces that were written constantly.
Thank you for your question. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in if we work efficiently. Can we do that? Are you in line for a question? Yes. Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Nadeem Shakroon. I'm a graduate of MIT, and I just work in the area now. But basically, my question is, so we started off with, I think, the most diverse group of candidates in history, and now we're down to 2 white guys.
Yeah, in their late 70s, right.
So my question is...
to run against another white guy in his late 70s.
Exactly,
right.
yeah. So is it an issue of like media coverage, or were voters scared of taking a risk on someone that might be different in the chance of...
The electability question in 30 seconds.
Exactly.
Anyone?
Okay. I have no idea. I mean, I have some idea. There are definitely strains of sexism and racism in American life and every aspect of it. So that goes for the media, that goes for voters themselves. Is that the ultimate reason that it came down to the people that are vying for the nomination today? You're never going to find an answer to that. Like if you want to ask, well, why didn't Cory Booker and Kamala Harris get more support from the black community? Well, Biden was really popular in the black community, and it was hard to shake that. And, both Kamala Harris and Cory Booker got out of the race before he took his dive kind of post Iowa and post New Hampshire. Were people unwilling to vote for a woman? Definitely some people are unwilling to vote for a woman. People actually say as much in polls too. Is that the ultimate reason it's Biden versus Sanders? How many times do we have to run the simulation to figure it out that it's exactly those 2 reasons, racism and sexism? I don't know, but there's no question that it exists in every aspect of American life.
I think it was media coverage and voters. I totally take your point. I think, and sometimes it was the campaigns themselves, quite honestly. I think, Kamala Harris came out, and again, because there's such a misunderstanding, because the only voters who are disaggregated are white voters, and so when Kamala Harris came out and said, no, I have roots in the black community, and she talked about, she was an AKA, a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, she talked about, hey, I went to Howard. And so I think, with some voters who some are on the vineyard, you belonging to a sorority and going to a private college, that resonates with them. How does that do with voters on the south side of Chicago, or in the SWAT, Southwest Atlanta, or in, South Miami? I don't know that everybody found that. Some people felt like, now I just feel alienated. I feel like you're a part of this elite black community that I was never welcome in. Cory Booker, I think, came out with this message of love conquers all, and no, I can't say what's in Trump's heart. I don't know if he's a racist, but love can save everything. By every measure of history, wars are not won by love, they're won by fighting. And so I think voters felt like, I don't know if you're the soldier I want to take to this war.
Love in the year of hate, the year of hate, 2020. We have time for one last question, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. Julie Wormser, I live locally. I'm thinking about what's in between now and November. Maybe we have a coronavirus pandemic, maybe we have a recession, maybe we have abortion and Obamacare Supreme Court cases. Will any of that matter, or is this just a get out the vote election?
Okay, can I all of that will hugely matter is my prediction.
But who will it matter to? Who will vote or not vote or switch votes?
Mike?
I'm going to defer.
I would defer back to Mike.
Okay, so don't you think that a Supreme Court ruling on abortion that was definitive in any kind of a way that changed the status quo could have an enormous impact on the turnout by women?
Sure, I feel like, and that's a pretty good list, by the way. And
It
like
is a
any
good
one of
list.
those at any moment, and you can add to it a global crisis, you could add to it an economic crisis, which may have been on your list or it certainly is related to the virus. Like any of those could blot out the sun, right? Like in the, especially the way news is covered and consumed. Like the point I was making earlier is the quantity is not our problem. We're more interested in quality. And for sure, any of those issues could overnight change the national conversation.
I think Republican voters tend to prioritize the courts more, and Democratic voters are going to have to start doing that if they want to remain competitive. Look, I think honestly, if there's anybody who has seen what happened the last 4 years and they think, you know, this Trump guy is onto something, I'm going to vote for him, there's probably nothing that can happen in the next few months that's going to change their mind.
Any last words?
Yeah, I think if Biden ends up being the nominee, it feels like it will be more of a referendum on Trump than if Sanders ended up being the nominee, in that it would be a choice between two like very different visions of America going forward. And so, you know, right now, looking at how Americans feel about Trump, that seems to be a potential positive for Democrats. But you know, it's hard to say. Trump was very unpopular when he was elected in the first place, and so maybe we can't base this just on favorability alone.
So maybe we have no idea what's going to happen. I don't. Before we go, I want to thank Mike Allen, Tiffany Cross, Galen Druke, Mark Gearan, Professor Allison, HKS, the IOP, and everyone here in the audience for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for being
Thank you,
with
Margaret.
us.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
That was so great. Thank you.